I'm Anne McDougall. I'm from the University of Alberta, Edmonton, Canada. My research has evolved over the years from an interest in social and economic history in the Sahara, particularly southern Morocco and Mauritania, into an interest in, I would say, various forms of servility and dependence. And I say that precisely because I don't like to define what I do in terms of studying slavery. However, to understand the societies in this part of the world, it is absolutely essential to understand the complexity of their social relations and the network of intersecting dependencies. So even the term servile is rather too black and white. But over the years, I've worked with particular families as well as studying the larger picture. And I just want to mention two. One was a man named Hamadi, who was a merchant. That's how I first got to know him. He was a merchant in a place called Atar in central Mauritania, and he has a very, very large family. And what is interesting about him is he became very well known, very wealthy, and his mother had been a slave, or at some point a freed slave. And so he comes from, if we can put it in those terms, sort of slave descent. And in Mauritania, people who have that origin retain it. It creates a particular social class. So his whole family now, who I've been able to interview, occupy that same sort of category. And then the second person was a woman who, I knew his family, not him, he was dead. But the second person was a woman who had been taken as a slave from Mali, the contemporary Mali, into Morocco. And I was able to interview her and get her whole life story because she was a slave of one of these very wealthy merchants. So there's the connection to my interest. And she was freed and had a whole life in southern Morocco. And I have to say that her name was Fatma. And between Fatma and Hamadi, they have defined a lot of my research for the last, I would say, 20 years. Again, I've been trying to think about that question, and I think the answer would have to be, and that's why I go back to people like Hamadi and Fatma, would have to be that probably the most interesting group in these societies is this group called RIT. In Mauritania in particular, they tend to be freed slaves and their descendants. So they are not considered noble, but nor are they slave. They're not free, but they're freed. And so when I began to try and understand Mauritanian society, it seemed to me that although people were either studying the nobles who were the merchants and the Islamic scholars, or they were studying slavery. And it seemed to me they were missing this huge, important group of people. It was sort of a catalyst that moved back and forth between different classes. And I've come to believe over the years, or actually was critical to holding that society together. And I've continued to look at that particular group. And that to me was surprising. I had no knowledge of and no real, I must say, interest in that group when I first began to work in the area. I asked the question myself in a slightly different way when I was invited to this conference, which was, well, what has forced marriage really got to do with what I'm interested in? And I thought that if I tried to look at one institution in particular in this society through the eyes of what if we thought of this in terms of forced marriage, I wanted to see what it would tell me. The institution I was looking at was concubinage. And very briefly, why that is tied to the question of forced marriage is that in Islamic law, particularly the Islamic law that is applied in this area, a concubine performs essentially the same legal functions as a wife, and a master with his authority over his wife can be compared to a slave owner's authority over his slave. And the whole idea is that each has the legitimate right to sex with a sexual relationship with these women, and that the children they produce are legitimate and, well, legitimate. Now, why it's interesting when you look at concubinage is that when a slave woman has a relationship with her master, and this was very common in Mauritania and southern Morocco, the children are born not just legitimate, which is what's important to the master, but they're born free, which is what's important to the woman. So this is one way in which a slave contributes to the free population. But it doesn't stop there. That part has been sort of generally understood, but it doesn't stop there because she has then a special status, and either during the lifetime of her master or upon his death, she is freed. And again, then she becomes that category of not noble, not slave, freed with a D. And so she becomes what's known as a hartania. And now we come back into my interest in this group as a sort of social catalyst, because then her subsequent relations are usually with other harteen, and they produce harteen children. So this woman, this concubine, who effectively lives something equivalent to a marriage, but by definition it's a forced marriage because she is a slave, she is forced into this relationship. She produces free children for her master's family, freed children for herself and future partners, and she herself becomes freed. So, in a nutshell, through forced marriage, and I put that in quotation marks, she acquires freedom for herself, her children, and others. And from what I can understand, it was such a common institution in this region that I think it's a very important piece of the social history of the area. And over the last 4 years, I've been working on a project where we were interviewing people about this. And I was surprised, so I'm now answering the second question over again, at how often people openly talked about the fact that either their mother was a concubine, named Jowry in this particular, or in instances where people talked about, oh yes, this was quite common. You know, our masters, and they don't say former masters, they simply say our masters would take our daughters. And, and so you suddenly realize how much this permeates the whole society. And again, no, we haven't been using the term forced marriage. I don't think using the term forced marriage would help. But having made myself think about it through that idea and having read some of the literature about it, it's helped give me a different angle on the importance of those women and the familial relations that defined them, and which in turn helped define that society. So I'm not sure if that answers your question, but I would say yet a third answer to your second question is I've surprised myself in trying to work through this. This wasn't quite where I expected to end up. I'm not finished yet because I still have to think through a number of issues, but it's been a very, very exciting process. And as I said, I've just been doing the interview, so it isn't something that only existed in the early 20th century. It isn't something that just existed a generation ago. There's a new dynamic in place that has allowed this set of social relationships to re-embed themselves in the, quote, modern society, wherein people are still retaining the relationships even if they're giving them different names. And so today, it's marriage with a hartania, which in Islamic law is completely illegal, but that's fine.